Patricia Jean Sibley. She was 4 years older than me. And Mother would say, Pat, take Nancy with you whenever she went out to play. And my sister would say, do I have to? But we ended up being good friends. And she was really active as a little kid. She swam and she ran and did everything you can possibly do as a little girl. And then her feet began to hurt. And my dad would take her to school and she'd be in tears because she couldn't walk on these painful feet. So Dad would take her with him on because he was an itinerant auto parts salesman. And finally they started taking her to the doctors and she had arthritis. At that time it was just called rheumatoid arthritis. Now it's called juvenile rheumatoid arthritis, which is different. And she ended up being paralyzed in every joint, except her jaw. She could eat and she could talk. And she was a lot of fun. She never, ever was unhappy. She smiled and laughed and talked. And she spent probably 3-4 years in hospitals. But when my children were born, they were her children. And she loved those little kids. And she had this wheelchair that by the time they were born, was power wheelchair. So she would sit them on her lap and she would run around in her power wheelchair. And we moved her into our home. We had an apartment for my mother and my sister after my father died. And when our middle grandson was born, he stayed with me quite a bit. And she took care of him. He would go down and he would pile shovels and trowels and all kinds of tools on her powered wheelchair, sit on her lap, and off they'd go to the woods so he could build a camp. And this was one of the joys of her life, was to take care of those children. But she was always, one time, one of the things I remember, because my grandmother and grandfather had this camp over at Horsehead Bay, or not a camp, it was a cabin, and the family would go over and stay with them. And Pat was sitting in her wheelchair up near the cabin, and we were all off someplace. I don't know where I was, but Grandpa and my grandfather and my father were off in the woods doing some work, and the kids were all scattered except for Patty, her oldest, my oldest. And all of a sudden Pat's wheelchair began to roll towards the bulkhead. And Patty was probably 6-7 years old, but she was very small for her age. And the only thing she could do was grab a hold of the back of Aunt Pat's wheelchair, where you pushed her, and Pat's legs were out over the bulkhead, and the tide was up. She would have gone into the water. And Patty just swung because she was so little. She was holding on to these handles and swinging. And everybody, and Pat and Patty were both yelling, and finally somebody came running and pulled the wheelchair back and got it stabilized. So those are the kinds of things that didn't bother Pat. It was kind of an adventure. And we took her out in a boat one time, and she got knocked off the seat of the boat because it was rough out there. And so the rest of the trip, she laid on the floorboards of the boat. And while we've got her back to shore. scared my mother half to death because we went out with 3 people and came home with 2. And that was the kind of thing that Pat did. And she loved all the adventure. She loved to go to camp. She loved the family, the whole family. And it's because my grandmother had had 8 children. That meant we had lots of aunts, uncles, cousins, and they all loved Pat. And they all took good care of her. So I was fortunate in that I got all the leftovers from all that.
That's like,
Oh, Pat lived to be. The doctor had told Mother when they finally were able to really do a good diagnosis that she probably wouldn't live to be 20. And so the years went on, and she went in and out of hospitals. She had to have a gallbladder surgery, and she lived kind of a normal sort of life, but it was always in the wheelchair. And she was 77 when she passed away. She passed away from a heart attack. So that was, and when we had her funeral, we had written a kind of a, what do you call them? Anyway, and the pastor was reading this. Well, we had a really, at that time, kind of a funny pastor. And I had written in there that she had lived as a feisty person. And he said, now, I'm sure Nancy didn't mean that. And everybody in the congregation said, oh, yes, she did. And that was how Pat lived and died. She was just always remembered, and always, the neighbors always visited her and brought her things. My life, when my husband and my daughter died shortly before Pat did, and those were very, very difficult for me. But when Pat died, it was almost harder, because she'd been with me all my life, and I would come home and think, oh, I've got to tell Pat. Oh, no, she's not here. And so all the things, all the parts of her that were important to me weren't there anymore. So it was really one of the hard deaths for me, was when I lost Pat. What happens is we'll be going along, and I'll say, oh, remember when Pat? And I have a little story to tell, but they're not always in my head. It's just they want me to write those little snippets, and I can't tell you what they were. So I would keep telling them, I'll do anything like answer questions, but that's how I talk best.